December 20th, 1944, City of Luxembourg. As General Omar Bradley clutched the receiver, his knuckles white against the black bakelite, the telephone line crackled with barely contained rage. Dwight Eisenhower's calm voice could be heard over the wire, issuing an order that would put their friendship to the test. The 1st and the 9th American armies were to be placed under British direction, specifically under Montgomery's leadership. "By God, Ike, if you do this, I cannot be accountable to the American people," Bradley screamed, his Missouri poise suddenly giving way. "I step down." Cold and exact was the Supreme Commander's reply. "Brad, the American people are looking to me, not you. Therefore, your resignation is completely meaningless." Bradley hesitated, objected once more, and then stopped talking. This incident, which took place during Hitler's Ardennes offensive, summed up 3 years of growing American annoyance with a British field marshal who appeared intent on proving he was the only one capable of winning the war. The most polarizing person in the Allied command system was Bernard L. Montgomery, the British hero and El Alamein conqueror. However, the more straightforward and incriminating question plagued American headquarters from Tunisia to Germany. Why was it that one man's personality, rather than the enemy, tore apart a coalition struggling to survive under Nazi tyranny? The solution was found in a series of events, choices, and conflicts that started in the sand of North Africa and finished in the muck of Northwest Europe rather than in a single incident. This is the tale of how military brilliance turned into military hardship, how Allied necessity clashed with national pride, and how the Americans began to feel a range of emotions, from frustration to almost hatred, toward their most notable British battlefield leader. Though politically difficult, the mathematics of Allied command were surprisingly straightforward. American soldiers were significantly outnumbered by British troops in Europe by the end of 1944. Britain's war-torn economy was dwarfed by American industrial output. However, it appeared that Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery was constitutionally unable to recognize these facts or modify his actions in light of them. Montgomery was seen by Americans as a symbol of colonial snobbery, aristocratic hubris, and an unwavering faith in British superiority, all of which they had waged a revolution to overcome. Montgomery, however, was not a parody. His soldiers admired him because he was truly intelligent, careful with their lives, and diligent in his preparation. His tactical prowess was evident, and his successes were genuine. After suffering setbacks in the early stages of the war, British soldiers had discovered in Montgomery a leader who managed casualty counts while winning battles. Churchill loved him. The people of Britain loved him. To American commanders, who were constantly ignored, pampered, and publicly denigrated by a field marshal who appeared to perceive them as eager amateurs in need of British direction, none of this mattered. The conflict started with something far more personal, respect, or the lack of it, rather than with big strategic disagreements. American commanders would learn from their initial experiences in North Africa to the ultimate triumph in Germany that Montgomery's treatment of them exposed presumptions about American worth, American bravery, and American ability that went beyond any conflict on the battlefield. March 6, 1943. Tunisia's Kasserine Pass. As Lieutenant General George S. Patton landed his jet to take command of the devastated Second Corps, the desert wind swept across the Tunisian countryside with the pungent stench of burning vehicles and defeat. In their first significant encounter with seasoned Wehrmacht soldiers, American infantry had been brutalized by German forces led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel 20 days prior. It had been a thorough, humiliating, and educational defeat. In addition to a disheartened command, Patton was met with a British command system that saw American forces as untrustworthy auxiliary forces that needed close control. An indicting assessment on American combat performance had been written by General Sir Harold Alexander, the new British commander of the 18th Army Group, which was in charge of all Allied ground forces in Tunisia. The commanders in America were inexperienced. Discipline was lacking among American troops. Before American units could be trusted with important responsibilities, they needed to be closely monitored by the British. There was some fairness in the report. Kasserine Pass had revealed real shortcomings in American combined arms coordination, leadership, and tactics. Alexander, however, responded in a way that went beyond criticism. He believed that the Second Corps should be given supporting duties, while the main offensive were carried out by British soldiers. Patton realized right away what was involved. This was more than just a Rommel defeat. The goal was to demonstrate that American weapons could be treated on an equal footing with those of the British. During this time, he wrote in his diary about British assumption and his resolve to aggressively demonstrate American value. As the commander of the British 8th Army moving eastward toward Tunisia, Montgomery personified the British presumptions that Patton disliked. The El Alamein victor exuded the assurance of a leader who had turned the tide of British fortunes in the desert. Through systematic, meticulously planned operations that prioritized overwhelming material supremacy above tactical flair, he had led Rommel throughout North Africa, though his demeanor suggested that he alone understood modern warfare and that others, especially Americans, had much to learn. His soldiers believed him because he triumphed without needlessly wasting their lives. These presumptions were mirrored in Alexander's operational strategy for the last campaign in Tunisia. The main strike on the Axis fortifications in southern Tunisia, known as the Mareth Line, would come from Montgomery's 8th Army. By carrying out supporting strikes, Patton's 2nd Corps would divert German focus from Montgomery's primary endeavor. While the British gained the honor of breaking through to Tunis, Montgomery would be protected by the Americans. There was military rationale to the strategy. Montgomery successfully led seasoned soldiers against German armor. Formations under Patton's leadership were still learning the ropes. However, the distribution of missions has consequences that went beyond tactical caution. It created expectations that would follow American commanders throughout the duration of the war. American forces would back British forces in the lead, while British commanders would be credited, and American accomplishments would be overlooked or downplayed. On March 17, 1943, Patton began his onslaught in the direction of El Guettar. His directives, which combined tactical direction with demands for strong leadership, reflected his personality and his determination to demonstrate American competency by aggressive action. Officers would take the lead. The same attitude of aggression that had marked American entry into the First World War would be displayed by American forces. The 2nd Corps would prove at any cost that it should not be viewed as occupying soldiers, but as a combat force. The vindication came from the Battle of El Guettar. 50 German tanks from the 10th Panzer Division entered the valley from mountain passes on March 23rd, launching a dawn assault intended to destroy American fortifications. The German commanders were stunned by what transpired next. Devastating concentrations of American artillery were unleashed on the advancing armor, with particular attention paid to overlapping fields of fire. The panzers were engaged at ranges that neutralized German tactical supremacy by tank destroyers, which were positioned to take advantage of topographical advantages. The battlefield was covered in wrecked German vehicles by the end of the day, and the 10th Panzer Division had been completely routed. In prolonged fighting, American forces had overcome seasoned German armored formations for the first time. However, the triumph had a sour aftertaste. The triumph of 2nd Corps received little attention from Alexander's command, which was preoccupied with Montgomery's operations against the Mareth Line. In ways that revealed ongoing skepticism about American competency, British staff officers continued to micromanage American operations by giving Patton explicit orders. Even more infuriating was Alexander's constant alteration of the 2nd Corps' goals and priorities, which seemed to be intended to keep American forces as an adjunct to British operations. Patton would be told to move forward, then stop, launch an armored assault, then take the lead with infantry. Every modification interfered with American operations and made it clear that the 2nd Corps was largely there to support Montgomery's plans, rather than to accomplish its own goals. In the face of resolute German opposition, Montgomery's initial attack on the Mareth Line on March 20th was not very successful. He showed the adaptability that defined his best operations by changing his primary effort to an outflanking move. However, the change took time, which gave German forces the opportunity to set up new defensive positions. The moment for a decisive pursuit had passed by the time 8th Army made inroads. In central Tunisia, 2nd Corps persisted in its supporting assaults, diverting German reserves from Montgomery's front. American forces made steady progress, capturing targets and killing Axis soldiers. However, British news mostly ignored these accomplishments. Montgomery's discovery was widely publicized. Even though Patton's role to the campaign was equally significant, it received less recognition. When General Eisenhower, Alexander, and French General Henri Giraud saluted at the victory parade in Tunis on May 20, 1943, the story focused on the accomplishments of the British and French, while giving American efforts only a passing mention. Tunisia taught American commanders more than just logistics and tactics. They discovered that battling with the British meant fighting not just for victory, but also for recognition. Regardless of his military prowess, they found Montgomery unable to approach American forces as real partners instead of promising apprentices. And they started to believe that this mindset was a reflection of both Montgomery's character and a larger British resistance to acknowledging that the alliance's power structure had fundamentally moved in Washington's favor. When the Allies focused on the next goal, these lessons would turn out to be prescient: Sicily's Gulf of Gela. Operation Husky, the invasion of Italy's largest island, began in high seas and darkness, as the largest amphibious assault in history rolled toward the shores of Sicily. An operation that would test Allied unity as severely as it tested German and Italian defenses involved 8 divisions, split between General George Patton's American 7th Army and General Bernard Montgomery's British 8th Army, storming beaches from Cape Scaramia to Syracuse. Operation Husky's plan had been controversial from the start. The original plans called for landings scattered over Sicily, swiftly capturing ports to guarantee sufficient supplies for operations that followed. Montgomery hated landings that were scattered. He was persuaded by his experience in North Africa that force concentration was crucial and that dispersing forces inevitably led to detailed failure. He expressed his disapproval and offered a solution on April 24, 1943. Focus all landings on the southeast corner of Sicily, thereby assigning the 8th Army the explicit task of driving directly to Messina, the northeastern port of the island, and the entry point to mainland Italy. Montgomery's proposal was rejected by Admiral Andrew Cunningham, who oversaw naval operations, and Aviation Marshal Arthur Tedder, who oversaw aviation operations. 13 Axis airfields would remain operational, putting the assault fleet at intolerable risk. Ships would have to stay concentrated in a small area, making them open to airstrikes. Their protests were significant. Both men were respected for their effective missions. The intensity of Montgomery's personality was fully displayed in his rejoinder. Supported by Churchill, he promised to quit rather than carry out a plan that he believed was seriously defective. Eisenhower convened a conference on May 2 to settle the conflict, which threatened to undermine the invasion as a whole. Fault lines that will deepen over the course of the war were revealed at the meeting. Montgomery made his point with an almost haughty air of certainty. Cunningham and Tedder resisted, arguing for the value of naval security and airfields. In the end, Eisenhower chose to support Montgomery in an effort to strike a compromise between coalition politics and military necessity. With 7th Army defending 8th Army's left flank and 8th Army advancing into Messina, the landings would primarily take place in southeast Sicily. The ramifications were clear to Patton as he reviewed the final plan in North Africa while getting his command ready for invasion. The 7th Army would provide help. The major assault would be led by Montgomery. While Americans protected their flank, the British would capture Messina. Once more, British leaders sought glory at the expense of American forces, who were reduced to supporting roles. The choice was controversial for reasons that went beyond Patton's enormous ego. American forces in the Mediterranean theater had significantly expanded by July 1943. The scale of the 7th Army was similar to that of the 8th Army, consisting of 3 infantry divisions, an armored division, and significant support units. Equipment from American industry was pouring into Allied stockpiles. The command structure viewed American forces as auxiliary forces to be used at British discretion, despite the fact that American air power dominated Mediterranean skies. Patton's fury was brutally clear in his July 12 diary note. Alexander had come to 7th Army headquarters with his all-British staff to explain the operational plan, which, according to Patton, prevented the Americans from capturing Messina. Alexander, who commanded both American and British forces, arrived without any American commanders on his staff. He observed bitterly. Patton acknowledged that American political leaders had agreed to a command structure that ensured American irrelevance and commented, "What fools we are." Despite disorganized airborne operations that saw American and British paratroopers dispersed around the countryside, many of whom drowned when their gliders crashed into the Mediterranean, the landings themselves proceeded fairly smoothly. Both forces had fortified their beachheads and were advancing inland by the morning of July 10th. Italian coastal division's initial resistance quickly broke down. Naval gunfire and resolute combat by the 1st Infantry Division helped defeat German counterattacks against Gela Beach, where Patton's soldiers landed. Montgomery told Alexander that the road to Messina was open, knowing that the Axis would yield to systematic British pressure. He would advance his 8th Army directly up the eastern shore. While Montgomery pursued what he believed to be a demoralized adversary, Patton's 7th Army should remain defensive, guarding the flank of the 8th Army. Montgomery's presumptions that American forces would provide protection and British forces would execute the decisive blow were exposed by the signal. Reality quickly crept in. Instead of disintegrating, the German forces took use of Sicily's hilly topography to create solid defensive positions. South of Catania, where German paratroopers occupied positions that directed British attacks into areas of death, the Eighth Army's advance stalled. Montgomery's meticulous strategy, which worked so well in the desert, was ineffective against defenders who could fight from planned positions and concentrate forces on small fronts. Anglo-American relations for the rest of the war would be defined by Montgomery's signal to Alexander on July 12th, when the Eighth Army's progress paused. In order to effectively commandeer a vital road that Seventh Army was assigned, he suggested that Eighth Army extend its operations area westward. He would be able to outflank German positions obstructing his progress thanks to the extended frontage. He recommended that American forces should hold off and defend while the Eighth Army carried out the offensive that would split Sicily in two. Just as important as the signal's content was its tone. Montgomery told Alexander of his plans and recommended that American soldiers make the necessary adjustments, but he did not ask for Alexander's consent. It was a startling assumption. Montgomery was suggesting relegating American soldiers to static defense, appropriating American operational zones, and implementing a plan that would guarantee that only British forces would be given credit for the victory of Sicily. Alexander concurred, his respect for Montgomery surpassing his faith in American leaders. He gave Montgomery the contested road on July 13th and told Patton to hold defensively while the Eighth Army attacked. The message was clear to the American commanders who received the order. British preferences, independent of American capabilities or contributions, would dictate Allied strategy. The political limitations that irritated American commanders throughout the war were evident in Patton's immediate response. Despite his rage, which he vented in diary entries likening Alexander to an inept sycophant and Montgomery to a haughty prima donna, Patterson obediently accepted the command. He was aware that Eisenhower, who was in charge of the Allied forces in the Mediterranean, could not afford for subordinate commanders to openly dissent. Compromise and accommodation were necessary in coalition combat, even if doing so meant putting aside legitimate rage. However, Patton was not going to let Seventh Army do nothing while Montgomery went after victory. Patton would establish a primary objective for Americans if Alexander refused to designate one. On July 17th, he flew with a proposal and a map to Alexander's headquarters. The Seventh Army would move northwest into Palermo, the capital and main port of Sicily, rather than defending passively. In addition to securing port facilities that would alleviate American supply issues, the operation would split the island in half and imprison Italian forces in western Sicily. Perhaps taken aback by Patton's effort, or just happy that American aggression was being diverted from Montgomery's operations, Alexander gave his approval. The Sicily campaign was drastically changed by the decision. The Allies would now launch two distinct drives up the East Coast, instead of a single British advance backed by American defensive actions. Montgomery would keep moving eastward and southward toward Messina. After racing to Palermo, Patton would head east along the northern coast of Sicily and drive for Messina. What started out as a tactical change quickly turned into a personal rivalry. Patton led his force with trademark vigor, determined to demonstrate American strength and get to Messina before Montgomery. The Seventh Army covered rough ground at a pace that Montgomery's cautious tactics could never match, shocking both allies and adversaries with its rapidity. On July 22nd, 12 days after landing, American forces captured Sicily's largest city and a key port when they invaded Palermo. South of Mount Etna, Montgomery persisted in hammering away at German defenses. His advancement was methodical, professional, and becoming less and less significant to the campaign's conclusion. German forces had started getting ready to evacuate to mainland Italy after realizing that Sicily could not be held. Which Allied army would arrive at Messina first and claim the symbolic triumph was the new debate, rather than whether the Allies would win Sicily. Character as well as skill were exposed during the race to Messina. Patton demanded an unrelenting advance, despite setbacks and fatalities, pushing the Seventh Army to its breaking point. His divisions were hard-pressed by their corps commanders, who were used to his manner. American engineers fixed bridges and roadways remarkably quickly. Support units found it difficult to keep up with the pace at which American infantry advanced across hot and rugged terrain. Montgomery's Eighth Army moved steadily forward against fiercer opposition on more challenging terrain. Trained to reduce deaths and conserve resources, British commanders declined to jeopardize catastrophes in the name of speed. The comparison demonstrated the core distinctions between the military cultures of the United States and Great Britain. Americans could afford significant losses and tactical risks because of their enormous industrial capacity and personnel reserves. With a declining manpower and a depleted economy, the British, who had been fighting since 1939, were unable to. The race was personal, though. Montgomery believed that the objective of 8th Army was more significant and more challenging than the actions of 7th Army, as evidenced by his public declarations and private letters. In Montgomery's view, American achievement in getting to Palermo showed nothing noteworthy. In secondary terrain, Patton had encountered less Italian resistance. The 8th Army faced seasoned German soldiers in defensive positions. Montgomery suggested the analogy was pointless. Montgomery's disdain for their accomplishments was viewed by American leaders as typical British snobbery. In Tunisia, they had heard similar evaluations. American commanders were patronized as eager but untrained, American accomplishments were downplayed, and American challenges were attributed to inexperience. This stance implied that British admiration for American weapons was entirely conditional and only existed when American forces were acting for British goals and under British leadership. Parts of Patton's 3rd Infantry Division arrived in Messina on August 17, 1943, a few hours ahead of the British. Despite winning the race, the 7th Army's triumph was void in ways that demonstrated the poisonous nature of Allied command dynamics. Montgomery's public response was polite, but subtly contemptuous. While congratulating Patton, he emphasized the challenges 8th Army had encountered and said that results were explained by terrain rather than skill. Montgomery's framing was mirrored in British press coverage. While the 7th Army's advance was portrayed as a distraction against weaker opposition, the 8th Army's battle against the Germans was praised in the reports. American accomplishments were recognized but downplayed. They were portrayed as enhancing rather than equaling British activities. The takeaway for American commanders who read these tales was unmistakable. British narratives would always emphasize British accomplishments, regardless of factual data. The wounds from the Sicily campaign would never completely go away. Although American commanders had proven that their forces could operate at the same pace and combat effectiveness as British troops, their British counterparts' recognition was still grudging and conditional. Specifically, Montgomery appeared constitutionally incapable of admitting that American leaders might be as skilled as he was, or that American troops would merit recognition commensurate with their accomplishments. Relationships were further damaged by 2 events that occurred during the Sicily campaign. Patton smacked injured soldiers he accused of cowardice on August 3rd and August 10th, starting a scandal that would follow him for the rest of his career. Montgomery responded to the news with a chilly dismissal. British presumptions regarding American emotionalism and lack of discipline were validated by Patton's actions. Montgomery implied that a British commander would never lose leadership in this way. Montgomery, a young British lieutenant, was assigned as a liaison officer to Patton's headquarters in the second incident. Patton became incensed when the lieutenant showed up with a shabby-looking luggage tied with string. Montgomery had already received a full liaison team from Patton, which included a major, a colonel, and a communications department. Montgomery had sent one subordinate officer with insufficient equipment in return. With a note explaining that he could not allow boys in his headquarters, Patton sent the lieutenant back. Although the episode was small, almost comical, it encapsulated the casual disregard with which Montgomery treated his American rivals. The size of Patton's army was comparable to that of Montgomery's 8th Army. By every measure of professional decency, he should have had liaison officials with a suitable level of authority and skill. Regardless of formal command connections, Montgomery's failure to furnish them indicated that he considered the 7th Army to be subordinate. One fact had become unassailable, as Allied planners focused on the invasion of Italy and then Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion of France. Bernard Montgomery considered himself the leading Allied battlefield commander and demanded respect from American subordinates. The British Field Marshal did not seem to notice that American commanders increasingly saw Montgomery as the main barrier to true Anglo-American cooperation. Or maybe it just didn't matter. 1st of September, 1944. France's north. Wehrmacht forces were in a headlong retreat to the east after the Allied breakout from Normandy had destroyed German positions in France. The liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944, was celebrated in scenes that seemed to signal the end of the war. Allied armies followed vanquished adversaries across land where, only months before, German forces had seemed invincible, from the beaches of Normandy to Belgium. Victory appeared within reach, possibly by Christmas. The time called for decisive action from Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who had just been promoted and was enjoying the victory of Normandy. In addition to his prior successes in North Africa and Sicily, he had led all Allied ground forces during the Normandy invasion, solidifying his reputation as Britain's finest military leader. Montgomery saw a chance to put an end to the war with a single, decisive thrust now that the German army were in disarray. However, a shift also came with September 1st, which Montgomery loathed with hardly disguised rage. All Allied ground troops were personally commanded by Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower. Montgomery, who had commanded both the American and British troops in Normandy, was now only able to lead the British and Canadian forces in Northwest Europe, known as the 21st Army Group. The 12th Army Group, which included the American 1st, 3rd, and 9th Armies, was led by his American counterpart, General Omar Bradley. The shift was unavoidable. British and Canadian troops were now greatly outnumbered by American forces in Europe. Allied operations were maintained by American logistics. European skies were controlled by American air power. The Allied victory was made possible by American industrial capacity. American leadership of a coalition that was now predominantly American was required by political reality. Although Montgomery was aware of the politics, he did not agree with the necessity or the consequences. He believed that the decisive leadership needed for victory was undermined by distributing command authority across several headquarters. Regardless of his political acumen, Eisenhower lacked the tactical expertise necessary to effectively lead ground operations. With growing stridency, Montgomery contended that the Supreme Commander's function should be restricted to logistical and political coordination. He maintained that only one ground forces commander, someone with Montgomery's demonstrated military experience, should have operational command. Montgomery himself was the clear beneficiary of the plan. The Field Marshal, however, framed his argument as one of military necessity rather than selfishness. Montgomery maintained that Eisenhower's intended approach, moving into Germany on a wide front with several armies striking at once, was strategically flawed. It ensured that the war would continue into 1945, distributed resources, and hindered decisive concentration. This was more than just vanity. The attempt to reframe the American victory as a British rescue was a form of historical theft. American commanders acknowledged that this was Montgomery's true account of what had happened. He sincerely thought that American forces had been spared because of his involvement. He thought it was perfectly okay to take credit for a fight that was decisively won by soldiers under his command for less than a month. A near-command crisis was brought on by the news conference. Angry beyond all diplomatic restraint, Bradley dialed Eisenhower. He stated that he was unable to serve under Montgomery. Bradley would step down if Eisenhower planned to assign the British Field Marshal permanent command of American forces. The threat of the ultimatum was not a mere one. Bradley, who was often the most diplomatically adept of all the American commanders, had had enough. Realizing that Allied unity was in jeopardy, Eisenhower tried to reassure Bradley while secretly writing a letter to the combined chiefs of staff. In it, he made it clear that until the Field Marshal apologized and stopped criticizing him in public, he would ask for Montgomery's assistance. Eisenhower suggested that the war was won, but it was unclear if the alliance would win. Only until severe British pressure compelled Montgomery to acknowledge his mistake was the problem resolved. Montgomery apologized and acknowledged that his news conference had offended Eisenhower in a letter dated January 12th. He wrote a letter of conciliation to Bradley, thanking him for the pleasure of temporarily commanding American forces and applauding them. The letters were polite, seemed earnest, and mostly unimportant. The damage was already done. It was now crystal clear to American leaders that Montgomery would never consider them true partners. Montgomery would evaluate each activity based on how it harmed his reputation. Every failure would be attributed to mistakes made by others or a lack of support. Each victory would be cited as proof of Montgomery's intelligence. This pattern was unchangeable, foreseeable, and unacceptable. However, there was more at risk than just personality conflicts. By early 1945, American dominance in Europe had become so clear that Montgomery's claims of battlefield superiority were no longer just annoying. They were now operationally detrimental. There were more than 60 divisions in American forces. Less than 20 British and Canadian soldiers were there. Allied operations were maintained by American logistics. European skies were controlled by American air power. Montgomery, meanwhile, persisted in acting as if American might must be directed by British wisdom. Anglo-American tensions were represented in the contradiction. After 5 years of war and the impending economic collapse, Britain found it difficult to accept the end of its dominance in the world. As the leading power in the globe, the United States was learning that its military might come with political obligations for which it was unprepared by American traditions. Montgomery became a symbol of Britain's refusal to accept its lower status because of his incapacity to adapt to these realities. Winston Churchill realized the risk after witnessing Montgomery's disastrous press conference. On January 18th, he addressed Parliament, carefully crafting his remarks to mend ties with the Allies. Churchill made it plain that the Battle of the Bulge was primarily an American conflict, an American triumph, and would go down in history as a legendary American win. As coalition partners should, British forces had provided help. In addition to rectifying Montgomery's story and recognizing military realities, the speech was a diplomatic imperative and signaled Britain's recognition that the war's final campaigns would be mostly American initiatives. British troops would take part, help, and split the win. However, American commanders would increasingly direct operations, dictate tactics, and assert the legitimacy of their forces' superiority. Montgomery commanded 21st Army Group in Northern Europe during the last months of the war, feeling alienated by his own actions and becoming less and less relevant to operations controlled by American armies. He conducted his business in a professional manner. Although he continued to have good tactical awareness, his rapport with American leaders never improved. Bradley stayed away from him. It was Patton who hated him. Eisenhower never again trusted his judgment or his intentions, although he did tolerate him as political necessity required. May 8, 1945. Germany unconditionally gave up. The war in Europe was over. In addition to defeating Nazi Germany, the Allied coalition also triumphed over internal conflicts that had threatened to destroy it on numerous occasions. Old disputes were momentarily buried in the joy of peace. An appreciative British public praised Montgomery. When American commanders went home, their accomplishments were celebrated. However, the tensions reappeared in post-war memoirs and histories. When Montgomery's memoirs were published in 1958, they rekindled old disputes by disparaging Eisenhower and subtly asserting that Montgomery had a better strategic perspective. As President of the United States at the time, Eisenhower severed personal ties with a former comrade who appeared intent on refighting battles from a lost conflict. In his 1951 biography, Bradley painstakingly detailed the ways in which Montgomery's actions had jeopardized Allied operations. The extent of Patton's disdain for the British Field Marshal was made clear in his posthumously disclosed journal. Based on these testimonies and official documents, American war history portrayed Montgomery as a gifted but challenging, intelligent but obnoxious leader, whose contributions were genuine but whose disposition made him a liability in coalition combat. Montgomery was supported by British historians who said that American leaders never valued his strategic sophistication, methodical approach, or concern for fatalities. They pointed out that since taking command in North Africa, Montgomery never lost a significant conflict. They underlined that D-Day was successful because of his preparedness and planning. They believed that American complaints were a reflection of hatred of British military traditions and jealousy of British professionalism. Decades after the participants' deaths, the dispute went on. Historians disagreed over Montgomery's actual accomplishments, the legitimacy of American annoyances, and the influence of personalities on military operations. Montgomery, according to some, was an excellent leader who was not well suited for coalition warfare. Others said that Montgomery's superior judgment was disliked by American leaders who lacked his expertise. Others maintained that the disputes were a reflection of the tensions that inevitably arise when proud nations try to work together in existential war. However, underneath historiographical arguments was a more straightforward reality, one that American Second World War commanders were absolutely clear on. Despite his skills, Bernard Montgomery was unable to handle American forces equally. It was up for debate whether this inability was due to cultural bias, personal conceit, or the British will to hold on to their waning dominance. Unquestionably, Montgomery's actions damaged Allied relations and unnecessarily complicated coalition combat. Lessons learned from the American experience in Montgomery lasted after the war. Personality disputes would not be allowed to undermine military performance in future coalition operations. Command structures would be made to guarantee equal participation and stop any country from gaining power based only on past performance or greater confidence. Additionally, American military culture would instill a skepticism toward allies who mistakenly associate cooperation with subjugation. The Field Marshal stood for what the Americans who fought with Montgomery from Tunisia to Germany felt they had abandoned in 1776. The belief that American strength must be guided by British wisdom, that colonial zeal needed urban sophistication to succeed, and that New World energy needed Old World experience to avoid catastrophe. They found that military accomplishment, industrial power, and battlefield prowess were insufficient to dispel cultural presumptions derived from centuries of British supremacy in the world. This was something Montgomery never grasped. He insisted until his death in 1976 that his actions throughout the conflict had been appropriate, his critiques were warranted, and his strategic vision was better than the alternatives. He continued to believe that the war could have been over sooner if his counsel had been heeded, that Eisenhower's leadership had been insufficient, and that American commanders had lacked his professional skill. Various conclusions were reached by American commanders who survived him. Although they questioned Montgomery's strategic judgment, they recognized his tactical prowess. They commended his meticulous planning, but pointed out that both bravery and caution are necessary to win conflicts. Although they acknowledged Montgomery's concern for fatalities, they also noted that his caution occasionally permitted opponents to avoid devastation. They came to the almost unanimous conclusion that Montgomery's mentality made coalition warfare more challenging than it needed to be. Years after the war, Eisenhower wrote the final evaluation. Although he recognized Montgomery's skills, he pointed out that the field marshal was completely incapable of comprehending the political aspects of coalition command. Eisenhower came to the conclusion that although Montgomery had unquestionable military prowess, his lack of diplomatic tact made him unfit for top command in Allied operations. Perhaps the most damaging criticism imaginable was that Montgomery's qualities were overshadowed by vices that compromised the very cause he served, rather than that he lacked military prowess. Montgomery was not just challenging, but also deadly in coalition warfare because of his inability to regard friends as partners, where personality has a considerably greater impact on effectiveness than tactics or strategy. Bitter experience taught the Americans this lesson. From German muck to North African sand, they learned that military coalitions need more than just common adversaries. They call for respect for one another, appreciation of each other's efforts, and a readiness to put the good of the group ahead of one's own ego. Regardless of his other attributes, Montgomery was unable to fulfill these demands. The reason the Americans detested Monty was found in that failure, not because he was British or cautious, but rather because he gave them the impression that they were colonial aides in a war they were winning. Soldiers whose judgment was unimportant, but whose blood was. Allies valued only for their role in advancing British glory. Montgomery, the generation he served with, and even the Cold War alliance that developed from collaboration during the war, were all outlasted by that memory. It acted as a constant reminder that technological prowess cannot replace human decency, and that military genius is meaningless if it alienates those whose collaboration is necessary for victory. Bernard Montgomery was a British hero, a meticulous commander, and a superb tactician. However, he also served as a warning to the Americans who fought with him about the limitations of military brilliance separated from diplomatic acumen. Whether or if Americans saw Montgomery's abilities was never a question. They did. Whether Montgomery could identify theirs was the question. He was unable to. And the foundations of a resentment that no amount of collective triumph could erase were found in that lack of creativity.